Again, I'm Marty Gleason from the K-State Research and Extension Service. My title is Extension Agent in Agricultural and Natural Resources. And you're currently discussing the Dust Bowl, the 1930s. It was the drought of the 30s, the 50s, and most recently we've gone through another series of drought. Technically, we're not through the current drought period here, and hopefully we're hoping that we're seeing the end of it, that we are still in drought conditions even today. And what I'm going to visit with you a little bit is about how farming practices have changed from the 30s. To be perfectly honest, we would have had the dirty 30s. We would have had the weather, the rainfall was very, very similar, and in some cases even less than we had during the 1930s. But we didn't have extreme dust like we did during the Dust Bowl. But even with our modern farming practices, you know, there were several times in the last couple of years that I-70 was even closed because of dust blowing across I-70, Interstate 70. So the 1930s started a lot, and they instigated a lot of agencies and began a change in our farming practices from the 1930s, what was done through the current times. Actually, the federal government established several things during the 1930s. In the early 30s, in 1933, established a Civilian Conservation Corps. And this was where, and I think you're going to have an opportunity to visit with the gentleman that was actually in that, and he'll go into a lot more detail on what they did during that time. I think Black Sunday was April 14th, 1935, and that forced Congress to do a lot of legislation. They passed a lot of legislation. In that year, they established the Soil Conservation Service, which currently is the Natural Conservation and Resource Service, NRCS. And that building, the agency is located just a block over in the USDA Service Center. With that, I will say that I'll just open it up for questions.
What kind of farming techniques did they have back then?
Well, farming equipment has evolved a lot, not just farming practices, but probably the most common was the plow, which, if you're familiar with the plow, brought up good, rich soil up to the surface. And unfortunately, that leaves it also very susceptible to wind erosion and water erosion. So we've gone from using plows to the type of equipment that does not disturb plant or leaves residue on top. And we've gone from conventional drills to no-till drills that can go through a lot of stubble, a lot of residue, and the residue is the main thing that we're looking at, keeping residue on top so that we don't have wind erosion.
What kind of crops do they grow to make that?
You know, Kansas has always primarily, wheat has been a major crop, and we didn't have a lot of corn until we developed irrigation. But in the 1920s and the 30s, they did plant corn, oats, barley. A lot of their crops that they needed then were grains for livestock, because we were just getting into machinery, so they had to have grains for livestock as well as grains for sale. So wheat, barley, oats, some corn was tried, some was not successful. And in those days, I think you have, you know, most of the farms had chickens. They had their eggs were grown. You had chickens for eggs and meat. Most everyone milked, so their milk was not purchased, it was grown there. And so everything kind of centered, you had livestock to be fed and livestock used in the farming operation.
Okay, that's all.
Are we still using a lot, the practices we used back in the 30s, are a lot of them still effective or not as effective, and are we going to take, based off of those, are we going to make them even better for farming today?
Farming has changed considerably since the 30s. We have a great deal of conservation reserve grasses, CRP, a very popular program where ground was taken out of production and put back to native grass. So in some cases, those contracts have expired, and some of those are going back into crop production, going back into cropland, and so we're back to plowing those fields just as they were done initially in the native grass. So yes, there is some tillage that is still the same, but today most of the tillage operations that we look to, like I said, we do minimum till, no-till, practices that really keep residue on the ground to prevent both wind and water erosion.
How did people react to not using the plow and using different new technology in farming?
I think you'll probably find people are people, and some people are very innovative and adopt new practices readily. Some like to cling to the old ways. But there were I'm sure in the 50s, I wasn't there, but I'm sure there were a lot of people resistant to change, just as always. But I think once something is proven, that people do adapt to it. And I think that most people have adapted to, over time, it's economically and environmentally beneficial to do so.
But the conditions are going to be, if we're on like an on and off drought, how bad is this going to affect this drought now, going to affect our future, really?
Drought, we've cycled through weather patterns, and they're impossible to predict. We've gone through several really severe droughts. This is the most severe that I can recall. But one thing that we have seen is the economic effect of this drought has been the least of any, simply because we've better coped with it through our farming practices. We were able to cope through it, and it did not have the dramatic economic effect that some of the previous droughts have had.
I've been hearing that the Ogallala Aquifer is draining, and since we use that water to help water our crops, what do you think we can do to prevent that from happening?
Irrigation has dramatically changed farming, especially here in Edwards County. In Edwards County in the late 60s, early 70s, there was very little irrigation. There was a lot of irrigation developed because we are in an area where the aquifer, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail, but basically the Ogallala is our water source, and it was abundant irrigation water. It was because of the proximity of the Arkansas River. It was really easy to develop irrigation. Currently we have, I believe, 711 center pivot irrigation systems in the county. And it is, economically, it has been a great boost to the county. And with everything else, it has some problems too. We see the aquifer, the water level is dropping down. And so now we have grounds, especially sandier soils, that would not have been broken out, would have been in native grass, that are now in cropland, that are well suited for irrigation, but not well suited for dryland farming. So it's going to have a dramatic effect. We can see, I think we will see a shift in the types of crops that we grow. Corn requires a great deal of water. Other irrigated crops do not. We have seen an influx of some new crops. Cotton has been tried in Edwards County. Not to a large scale. Crops like canola are being experimented with here. Wheat will probably always be a staple in Kansas. It's just because our temperatures, our rainfall are very well suited for wheat. It's been the staple crop of the state, and it will probably remain that. One area that probably we may see an increase is grain sorghum. I call it milo, some people call it grain sorghum. It has always been used as a livestock feed, and it's been a good livestock feed, and it too is well adapted to Edwards County and the Kansas environment. It is now being grown as a food source for humans, for human consumption. We now have food grade grain sorghum, and I think that's an area that's going to really develop in the future, food grain sorghum. That is probably one of the biggest challenges that we face today is the depletion of the Ogallala. On the opposite side, we have a growing population, so we need food production. And how we're going to balance those two, one of the things that has happened is we've greatly increased the efficiency of irrigation. But even at that, with current rainfall, we're not replenishing the aquifer as fastly as we're depleting it. So we don't really know. We may be looking at legislation to regulate irrigation water. I think we are developing crops that require less water. We're doing a lot of research on timing of irrigation. 30 years ago, if you drove in Edwards County and saw center pivots, they were up in the air and on the highways, and water was going everywhere. I don't think we have any center pivot. The 711, I think they all now have what we call drop nozzles, where the water is put down low, greatly reducing evaporation, which had a double effect. We use less water and increase yields at the same time.
What types of techniques will you pass down to the next generation for farming?
I think what we've learned that works very well is tillage that keeps residue on the soil. To avoid bare ground. That's probably going to be the key. The second is going to be conserving water, moisture to the largest extent that we can. Those will probably be the two main things are going to be water conservation and residue management.
What do you see this area of Kansas being like in 25 years? What do you see for the future, or 50 years?
Unfortunately, this part of Kansas, I would like to say it will be very similar. I do not see our population, if we can maintain it, will probably, I don't see growth because we have a much smaller farming community than we had in the 50s and in the 30s, simply because a single individual can produce so much more. We don't need as many people because of our equipment. One producer is able to farm more acres than they were in the past. That trend will probably continue. Crops, I'm hoping that we will see efficient use of irrigation. We know that for food and fiber we need those commodities, but I think we have become much more efficient, but we're going to have to continue to become more and more efficient in irrigation. One of the things that is in the last 10 years, subsurface irrigation, irrigating underground and having no surface water exposed. And that's going to be, I think that's going to dramatically change the face of Edwards County, because I think you're going to see a lot fewer center pivot systems, which has just become landmark here at center pivots. And I think in 25 years, they'll be gone